today too. So, and happy Arbor Day. Arbor Day, I work in forestry for the DNR, and Arbor Day was actually April 10th, and it was started in Kansas City because they planted 1 million trees. So just a little tidbit for you there. But today we're going to talk all about worms because worms are starting to come up in the soil and everybody wants to get outside. So you're going to learn a lot of really cool things about worms once we get through all of our technical difficulties, which I apologize for. So, and lots of questions I'm sure you'll have, and you all will be experts when we're done.
All right, and Bernie, you should have access now to share your screen.
Yep, okay, there we go. Okay, so if you didn't see my screen, we're just going to go through some really fun, cool slides, and I'm going to tell you some interesting things about worms. And in Wisconsin, we have all these different worms that people have been talking about, but we have, and I love worms, so you'll know things about them that you probably never wanted to know. But these worms on the front are actually my favorite worms. These are night crawlers, and these are Lumbricus terrestris, and they're just the coolest worm you'll ever be able to encounter. But there's a little bit of history when you talk about earthworms, because when you look at earthworms, everybody sees all the birds coming back into it's spring, the flowers are coming up, and the robins are out there. So I was watching robins this morning in my backyard, and the robins, they love earthworms. And then when they tilt their head to the side, it's because they can actually hear the worms moving underneath the soil, so they grab onto them. So earthworms are really good because they're providing food, and everybody that's putting in a garden right now, they compost your waste. So if you have a compost pile in the back of your house, and they're providing food for lots of different animals other than just birds. So again, I was watching some of the animals in my backyard today. So there was a little mole running around in the backyard, and moles eat earthworms, which we can talk about later too, but really fun things that they do. That organic material, they're recycling everything. They are nature's recyclers, and earthworms provide fertilizer, which we all need when we're growing all of our new vegetable plants out there. But the number one reason why you really like earthworms, does anyone know? I know you can't hear me, but the number one reason why you really like earthworms is because they're just all around super cool animals. So they are an amazing animal. And I encourage you after we get through this to go out and look for some, because you'll really be blown away by what they can do. But on the flip side, when you look at earthworms, you know, they're not native to Wisconsin. So they're really technically an invasive species. And this little guy with eating the worm here is one of my favorite small animals. This is a mole. This is a garden mole. You can find them in any of your gardens, and they are the #1 earthworm hunter out there. And the really cool thing about moles is that when they bite a worm, they actually have a neurotoxin in their saliva. So when they grasp onto that worm, they sort of stun it, and then they drag it back to their home, and then they store all of these worms like in a refrigerator, and they eat them at a later time. So how cool is that? Not many animals can do that. But earthworms, they're invasive. So they really aren't technically native to this area of North America and not Wisconsin at all. Earthworms can change the soil chemistry. So when we're growing big trees in the forest, it's really important that you have the right pH, the right nitrogen levels in your soil. And when earthworms get in there, because they're really hungry and they're eating all the time, it changes that soil chemistry, and it changes the dynamic of how things will grow. And earthworms, amazingly enough, they can really impact how things grow. So how many of you, I'm sure, have seen garlic mustard growing out there in the Madison area? If you've gotten pulled garlic mustard, or you're familiar with like Dame's Rocket or some of those other weedy plants that are out there, we often will say what came first, the invasive plant or the earthworm. And I guarantee you that if you're looking at garlic mustard, the earthworms came first and the garlic mustard followed, because they co-evolved together. And so when you have species co-evolving together, they encourage one another to spread. So it's a really interesting relationship out there. Earthworms also damage forests, And again, I work in forestry, so the main thing that we're looking at is having healthy trees, and we want trees to grow big and strong, but earthworms and a lot of our native trees really don't go hand in hand because they can be really highly damaging. All right, number one phrase that we always hear out there, who opened the can of worms? This is a little bit of history for you because earthworms have a really unique history to them, because when people think about them, they think, oh, I'm just going to put them on the end of my my fishing rod. I'm going to catch some things with them. But earthworms, they have a long history. And if you do some reading, or your parents have been watching PBS, there is a famous person out there that studied earthworms for over 40 years. And his name just happens to be Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin wrote the Earthworm Bible. So it's what we consider like the #1 resource for all the history of earthworms, because studying them for 40 years, he was able to understand them and what they do. And Charles Darwin considers them one of the most influential animals on the face of the earth. The interesting thing, too, is Charles Darwin lived a long life, and this book was published at the end of his life. And Charles Darwin was a Victorian, so the Victorian era, we had Queen Victoria, who was the longest reigning monarch in history, until Queen Elizabeth, the current reigning monarch, just currently ticked her off by a few years. But they were Victorians, and they were game changers. So the Victorians actually removed, I like the art on the screen, they actually removed worms from the soil because they considered them a pest, and they thought Charles Darwin was sort of crazy for talking about worms this way. But what Charles Darwin did was that he wormed his way into their heart, and everybody started to like earthworms. All right, earthworms, they're not just the ones in your backyard. There's 9,000 species and counting. They're aquatic, they're terrestrial. They come in all different shapes and sizes, all different colorations. They have all sorts of adaptations, which they do. One in particular, which I'm really fond of, is called is a bioluminescence worm. So it's a way that when the worm is being hunted, it releases a bioluminescence, which is really sticky, which causes the predators to drop it. So it's a really cool worm. And that one you can find in southeast Ohio. So lots of worms out there, and only a few that people really care about. All right, worms in Wisconsin. Pretty flat in Wisconsin, and we had a glacier that moved through Wisconsin. So when you're looking at Wisconsin, there's not a lot of mountains. There's a lot of hills, but not a lot of mountains, because we had a glacier that moved across the state roughly 10,000 years ago. And when that glacier retreated, it left everything sort of flat, and we look at the regeneration of all of our native species without the presence of earthworms, because all of the earthworms that we currently have in Wisconsin are all European and Asian in origin. So they aren't native North American earthworms. So, and again, you can look at the glacial history of Wisconsin, and it goes back, you can go back about 50,000 years, and you can see that there were previous glacial movements that moved across Wisconsin as well. Now, cool things about worms, this is just a little break for you. So fossilized worms, similar to earthworms, they've been found in rocks. And they're roughly 600 million years old, so they're very old. So they predate fungi, which is huge when you think about that. Earthworms, when you're looking at a single acre of land, so if you're driving around or you're by a farm and you see the farmer out there tilling his soil, for every acre of land, there's roughly 1 million earthworms. And by the end of the growing season, that number has ticked up roughly 2 million, 3 million, depending on what the resources are there. Now, earthworms, they're really hungry, and this is what makes them a problem sometimes. They're always eating, so they eat half of their body weight to their entire body weight all day long. Earthworms don't have any ears or eyes. Their entire body acts as a reflective mechanism. So it was raining yesterday. We might get a little bit of rain today. If you happen to see an earthworm out on the sidewalk or on your driveway, you can actually go over to that earthworm and provide it some shade with your hand, and that earthworm will actually speed up and move because it senses the reflection of your hand. So it will get to the other side into the grass really quickly. And earthworms, they breathe through their skin. So that's why they are always moving after it rains or after you're watering your lawn. You see them out there because you've essentially drowned them. So they have to get to another place because they have to start breathing, because their entire body acts as their lungs as also their eyes. So really complex species there. Earthworms also have red blood, just like us. They're red-blooded. You can never break an earthworm's heart because they roughly have 1 to 5 hearts depending on the earthworm. So it's hard to hurt them. And earthworms are 90% water compared to the 75% water that we are. So we have a lot of similarities. Earthworms, how many of you have ever picked up an earthworm and you have all of that slime all over you? That's earthworm slime, but it also helps them build their tunnels, and it also helps them reproduce. It's a really important function in the reproductive system of an earthworm. All right, earthworms, if you're going to go outside today, or you're going to be out this weekend, you definitely want to look at your earthworm functional groups, because earthworms, like us, they like to live in different places. Some people like to live in the country. Some people like to live in the city. Earthworms do the same thing, but it's in the soil. So we drop them into these groups that we call functional groups. And the first earthworms that you're always going to see out and about are always going to be the epigeic species, which are the little gray worms, the pink nose worm. They're always going to be right on the soil surface. You're going to see them pretty easily. They're sweet little worms, cute as a button. And then after that, you're going to go down and you're going to see like the endogeic species. Those are your red wigglers, your leaf worms. And then my favorite worm, because everybody should have a favorite worm, is the night crawler. So the night crawler is that deep one that you usually see out on the sidewalk. Those are the ones that your parents may put on the end of your fishing pole. Those are the ones that are those big, robust ones that you kind of think, wow, is that a big worm? They are an amazing animal, but they tunnel down in the soil, and those are the ones that you have to be the most patient for when you're looking for them, because they are an advanced species. So with that, we move on to earthworm ecology, because earthworms are detrivores. They turn over soil, they turn over decaying matter, they turn over everything in the soil, and they feed that soil, and you get that fungus layer, you get all of these really cool things happening there, and that's the most important thing if you want things to grow in your garden. And I'll give my plug for one of my favorite books by Gary Larson, There's a Hair in My Dirt. If you don't want to read Charles Darwin's book, you definitely want to read this book because it covers everything. It's the Cliff Notes to Charles Darwin's book, and it's really fun, and you'll learn a lot from it, more than you'll learn from this talk. So, earthworm biology. Well, earthworms, I think you're all old enough for this because everybody should know this, but earthworms are promiscuous, polygamous hermaphrodites, and some can reproduce parthenogenically. And if none of you understand some of those words, you can ask your parents what they mean. But essentially what it means is that earthworms are really social animals. They enjoy one another's company. They're very complex. They're always reproducing. Some they have to mate, and others don't have to mate. They're already primed, and they're going to drop their eggs, their cocoons in the soil, and they're going to be ready to go. But when you look at an earthworm, and particularly you're looking at that sort of band on the sort of off center on the body of the worm, that is called the clitellum, but we also call it the saddle. And everything important is happening right there in that saddle of the earthworm, because that's where the reproductive organs are. That's where we have the male and the female pores. And if you're really lucky, particularly this time of year, it is earthworm mating season, so you can actually see earthworms mating. And so they'll flip over and they'll mate with one another. And then after they do this, they shed cocoons. And when they shed the cocoons actually roll off the top of the earthworm's head. So that's a really cool thing about this particular animal, that it drops its eggs off of its head rather than off of its butt. So it's a different thing when you're talking about earthworms and how they reproduce. And the cocoons themselves, when you're looking for them in the soil, they're really beautiful, and you'll be able to see them right away once you start looking for them. So this is a Lumbricus terrestris earthworm, so you can see that this earthworm right here, you can see the baby earthworm right in there. And in there, this cocoon, if you were to place it in your hand and you were to apply a little bit of pressure on it, you could pop it and out would come a baby worm. And roughly 90 to 120 days later, you would have an adult worm. So they're beautiful. Depending on the type of species of earthworms, you can have 20 eggs in there. And earthworm cocoons are primed they're really tough things. They can hang out in the soil for up to 15 years, depending on how long, what the wet weather is. If everything's right, then they can hatch. But you're always going to have these cocoons in the soil, and most people are going to overlook them. And the eggs, again, 15 years being dormant in the soil. So that cocoon in itself is ready to support life for a very long time, depending on when it's ready to hatch. And just to give you a picture of some of the most common earthworms that we have here in southern Wisconsin, I guarantee you if you walk out of your yard and look in your yard in Madison, anywhere around southern Wisconsin, you're going to be able to find these. So Lumbricus terrestris is my favorite one. And you can see the beautiful cocoons right next to it. So just a quick example of it. Rubellus is another one, which is in the same family as the nightcrawler. They're a little different because you can see a defined red vein in the rubellus one. So that's your leaf worm. The red wiggler is one that we commonly use for composting. And another one of my favorite worms, which I guarantee you'll see this summer, you'll probably even see it today because they're really active right now, is the pink nose worm. And the pink nose worm is a really cute little worm. It's always going to be in your soil. It turns it over. It does wonderful things. Not bad at all. But the cool thing when you talk about these worms, I don't know how old all of you are out there, but when you're looking at these worms, so the pink nose worm that we have circled right there, its lifespan, it generally lives about 4 years. But the big nightcrawler up on the left-hand side, when you're looking at a nightcrawler, the average age of a nightcrawler is about 10 years old. So it's a long-lived animal. It's an amazing animal. So I always try and make people feel bad if they put them on fishing hooks because it's a very long-lived animal, and during its lifetime it's going to mate and shed cocoons, and it's going to go on and on. But really an amazing animal when you're looking at it across the board. One cool thing about earthworms, because we are in Wisconsin, earthworms have a herding mentality to them. So I always think this is really neat. I pulled this out of an earthworm journal that's published in England every year. And they actually did a study a few years ago about how earthworms will herd up much like cattle. And it's true. We did some surveys out in the forest. We did some surveys out in ag fields. And when we looked at the earthworms and how they all sort of herd out in the same directions once you disturb them. So they have a similar action of cows. So I thought that was really cool to add for Wisconsin since we are the dairy state. All right. In your woods, when you talk about earthworms, we want to grow trees, and particularly today it's Arbor Day. So where we live in southern Wisconsin, we live in a really disturbed area. So we're in an urban environment. We have neighborhoods, we have backyards. But if you're going out and you want to grow trees in a forest, it's really important to look at the understory of the forest and understand the soil dynamics. And when we get a lot of earthworms in a forest setting where we're trying to grow trees, it shifts how things will grow, because when you walk into a healthy woodlot, into a healthy forest, you want to be able to see build up leaf litter. So instead of raking all the leaves like you do on your yard in the fall, you want all of that leaf litter to stay on the forest floor, because the leaf litter on the forest floor essentially acts as the skin of the forest. So it's protecting that soil. But when earthworms start to consume all of the leaf litter, they pull it down into the soil column, and it changes that dynamic, and it makes it more prone for non-native plants to come in there. And so it compacts the soil, and then you get more earthworms coming in there, and then you get more non-native species coming in there. So the thing to remember about earthworms, where we live, they're fine. It's just that we always want to be careful with them when we're growing native species, because they can change things in the soil. All right, what about those other worms? Those other worms that we talk about a lot now in Wisconsin are the jumping worms, and they are a We consider them a restricted species, but they're a lot like us. You can't get away from them, but they're relatively new to Wisconsin, and they look different than the European earthworms that we've been talking about so far. These species of earthworms originate from Asia, and you can really find them in the Korean Peninsula, Japan, China, and they're not well studied and they're not well understood, but they're much more aggressive than the European earthworms that we're used to. And these worms, they're really cool worms because they can do amazing things that the European earthworms can't do. And if you notice the arrows on the screen, you can see that they have their clitellum, that saddle on them is almost white to gray, and it's really smooth. And this worm looks a lot different than European earthworms. And again, we don't understand a whole lot about them. We've been sort of chipping away every year. We learn new things about them, but they are a new invader. They're moving around the country. But again, in Wisconsin, we think we've probably had them for about 20 years. It's just they acted like another invasive where they were here, but nobody noticed them. But they're really unique soil species that people should be aware of. And we consider them a secondary invasion because when you're looking at it, these worms can really change how things are. So when you look at European earthworms, when you go out in your garden today, you'll see that you have all of these different European earthworms and they all sort of live together and they don't bother one another. But once you get these jumping worms in there, they're really aggressive and they don't get along well with all the European species. So we see a shift in the types of worms that we're seeing because these ones we suspect have some qualities to them that make it inhospitable for other European earthworms to be there. So it's a unique thing that's happening there. And since we're in Madison where we have a lot of them, it's a really interesting way to research them. And these worms, when you're looking at them, they're darker, they're really active. We call them jumping worms because if you do have them, they literally will thrash and sort of jump out of your hands. And there's a lot of them. And the really interesting thing that we found this year was we had a mild winter in Wisconsin. And so the mild winter allowed cocoons to pretty much hatch through the entire winter, early spring. We're moving into late spring right now. And so we're finding adults really early this year, which indicates to us that they were able to thrive during the mild winter that we had. And because of this, we know that we're going to have a big population of them later in the year because these worms, they're not long-lived animals like the European earthworms. They tend to just be here for a season. They hatch, they shed cocoons, and then when it gets cold in the fall, they pretty much die, but they leave a lot of cocoons behind. So they leave a lot of things in the soil that we're not prepared for. And you can see that they change the soil so it looks really different. It looks like your coffee grounds, and it really outcompetes the European earthworms. And when you're looking for these earthworms, if you remember from one of the earlier slides, these are epigeic species, so they're right on the surface of the soil, so they're pretty easy to catch. And when we've been doing surveys in the Madison area, because there's so many of them, we'll tell people, yeah, if you can just pick up a few worms for us, they're really active. They're fun to catch, but there's so many of them, they're almost like a potato chip. You just can't get one. You want to get more and more and more. So really unique earthworm. And so if you happen to be out there and you see any adults, let us know at the DNR because we're sort of interested in why they're already completely mature this year so early in the season. And this is just a quick comparison of these earthworms. So you can see the jumping worm on the one side is much darker, the saddle is much closer to the head, and you can see that on the red wiggler there, you can see the clitellum is much more fleshy. It's a pink worm, and just very different in appearance and also characteristics in how they act. Most European earthworms aren't really all that active, but the jumping worms are extremely active, and there's bunches of them all at once, not just one or two here and there. And this is just a quick comparison, so you can see two of the species that are really common, And I will say this is a really unique dynamic that we uncovered in the past year. So we have Amynthus tokiensis and Amynthus agrestis, and you can see the size difference between them. But what we realized that these two need to be in a relationship together. So it's a unique relationship, what I'll skip ahead to for a second. They are in a relationship where they actually need to be together. And if the agrestis doesn't have the tokiensis, then the population of the agrestis will plummet. So they're almost like friends in the soil. They need to have one another there. But then when you're looking at these earthworms, again, on the left side, you see that we have the European earthworms, and then we have the jumping worms, and they don't get along either. So once you get the jumping worms in, you sort of lose all of the night crawlers because they can't coexist together. And just to go back to these slides, because a lot of people ask us, how can we control some of the worms? So, instead of like pouring chemicals on your lawn or going out there and you have different things happening, you don't want to, in your own garden, if you're growing food, if you're growing things and you want to be more natural, you want to look for more holistic ways to control things in your garden. So one of the things that we've uncovered is that the jumping worms don't like a lot of plants that are high in a soap. So that's called a saponin. And I know that's a big word, but it just means that it releases a soapy quality to it. And so one flower that we have all over Wisconsin, people use it in their gardens and border plants, you can find it on roadsides anywhere, is soapwort. And it's a plant that is high in saponins, which is just sort of a soapy secretion, which will decrease the earthworm populations. And another one that we found too that was really high in this soapy residue was alfalfa. And if you're looking for worms in an alfalfa field, it's really hard to find them because this plant again is really high in this soapy quality. So a lot of playing around with that just for the more holistic outlook on how you control things in your garden. And again, that relationship with the agrestis and the tokiensis, they're friends, they sort of need one another. And so we've also been looking at, well, hey, if we get rid of the tokiensis, will it drop the populations of agrestis? And yes, we know it will, because for some reason they need to be together, which if you're looking at that across the animal world, that's a really unique thing to see happening at the soil level. And again, when you're looking for these worms, they're everywhere. You can just find buckets of them, easy to pick up and pull around. The cocoons in the soil, hard to see these cocoons. The cocoons of the jumping worms really look like soil themselves, so it's hard to identify them. And that's the cocoon bank. But when you're looking for them, it's hard to isolate them. But when you do isolate them, you can see how small they are and how they look like soil themselves. But we do know now that if you heat your area of the soil, or you tarp an area and get it up to 104 degrees and you hold it for a while, you can kill off those cocoons, which will sort of alleviate some of the pressure of the population of the earthworms. And how they're moving, well, we know earthworms move with us because we like to move things around. We like to garden, we like to buy plants. So we know that they're moving all over Wisconsin. So we just ask people to be aware of it and spread the word. So now that you're all learning about worms, you'll know everything that you can tell people if somebody asks you about a worm. Compost piles, you never want to get into those because you can get a lot of different things, but definitely you're going to get worms if you pick up free compost. Plant sales, lots of plant sales. Not necessarily happening so much this year, but hopefully they'll start again next year. But plant sales, if you're sharing plants with your neighbors, just ask them what type of worms they have, because you want to try and protect yourself from the jumping worms. And just a little fun story that happened in Madison a few years ago. I was there on a Friday afternoon, and I had a lady call me about worms on her driveway and how when she walked out in the morning, she slipped on worms on her driveway. And I hear a lot of worm stories at the DNR. I get a lot of calls, but she said, you have to come out here. They're all over the yard. And when I went out there, they were pouring out of her landscape. They were coming up everywhere. So there were worms everywhere. it was like out of a movie. So if you really like worms, you were squealing with delight, but I've never seen that many worms. And it is right in Middleton. So if anyone wants to go on a field trip later this summer to see this amazing worm site, it comes back every year, bigger and better than before. But these things do happen. And so that makes worms sort of interesting in how their populations are exploding like that. Best things that you can do, worms are great in your garden. And, you know, we talked about European earthworms and we talked about the jumping worms. All things have qualities to them. And while we don't understand the jumping worms all that well at the moment, we will continue to understand them a bit more. And even though they're a new arrival to the state, a new arrival to North America, they will have some qualities which we can tap into because they are turning over the soil. They're making the soil richer in nitrogen, which can be really beneficial for some plants. And then the European earthworms have been here ever since we came here. So when we had the first settlers, the first explorers come to the New World, and they dropped the ballast of the ships along North America, those were the first introduction points of many of our European earthworms, and we've been able to utilize them even though they are technically non-native invasive species. Farmers are dependent upon them. If you have compost bins, they do wonderful things because they're turning over your soil and they're providing you with a product which is feeding your plants. So we always like to end on the good note that even though these things, you know, earthworms across the board may not be native to North America, they do have qualities to them. And as we continue to learn and discover and research that, we will find more things that are beneficial for them. But for now, we always just ask people, be aware of what you have. And if you're worried about some of the jumping worms or introducing worms across the board to areas that don't have them, just educate yourself, educate others. So now that you're all worm experts, you'll be able to tell everybody about the 2 different types of worms that we have. And watch your plants, you know, tell people what you're doing. Just be aware and spread the word, not the worm. And with that, I will leave it. If you have some questions, I'm happy to take any questions because if you haven't noticed, I love worms. So.
And I just want to share, if you have a question, you can unmute yourself in the bottom left-hand corner, share your question, and then just remute yourself so Bernie can answer.
Unmuted. Yeah, it's unmuted. Go ahead. You can ask your question, Jenny.
How does worms like when you split them in half, how are they still wiggling?
That's a great question. So you've heard people tell you if you cut a worm in half you get 2, but we could have another talk some other time about these other worms that are called planaria. But for terrestrial earthworms, if you cut a worm in half, the worm itself has all of these connecting nerve endings. And so if you cut it in half, those connected worm endings, or the nerves, they'll still move. They'll move for roughly about 10 minutes after you cut it in half. But if you cut a worm, the other part of the worm that still has that clitellum on it, so that fat saddle part sort of off center, that worm is going to keep living, and then it'll just grow a little stubby tail on the end, because as long as you have that intact saddle on the earthworm, the part with that will stay alive, but the tail will twitch. The tail that you cut off will twitch for about 10 to 15 minutes. And the other worm that we didn't talk about, those are planaria worms. And we have lots of native planaria in Wisconsin, and they're really fun worms. And those are the ones that you can just split right down the middle and it will separate and you'll have 2 worms. So.
When are we gonna see the worms?
When are you going to see the worm? Well, the worms are out right now. So I would go out and dig around in your yard right now. And then there's a couple of cool tricks to get worms out of the soil. So if you happen to have mustard in your refrigerator, you can actually take a tablespoon or so of mustard and stir it around in, a couple big cups of warm water. You can go out to your garden and you can sort of sprinkle it over the soil. And that mustard in the water will irritate the worms and make them come to the surface. So all the worms are out. They're all moving and they're pretty active. But the most important thing to keep in mind about worms like to come out when it's a little bit darker. So during the day, it's sunny right now. Worms are underneath the soil because they have to stay cool. But if you go out in your backyard or your compost pile, like say around 5:30, 6 o'clock tonight, that's when they start getting more active. They start coming up because they like cooler weather and they like it to be a little bit darker outside.
Are worms a good pet?
Are worms a good pet? Well, if you like worms, sure, you can. I mean, but they're not very interactive. You can certainly watch what they do. If you want to bring worms into your house, you can certainly put them in a terrarium. You got to keep them moist, and you've got to give them food to eat. So you would give them any of your vegetable scraps. And the really cool thing about worms, if you're patient enough, you can actually watch the worms come up to eat. And one of their favorite treats are maple leaves. So if you happen to have a maple in your yard or on your street, some of those sort of decaying maple leaves from the fall, go and pick some of those up. And if you have a worm, if you put a worm in a box or a bowl and you want to see it eat, worms will actually come up and they have a proboscis much like a butterfly, and they'll actually come up and they'll grab onto that leaf and you can watch them sort of consume it. But you have to be patient because it's not going to be really quick. They're sort of slow.
What do worms eat? That's one of my questions.
Oh, what do they eat? Well, earthworms they have all sorts of preferences. So earthworms are a lot like us. They like things that are sugary, that are high in carbohydrates, and that have a lot of potassium to them. So they like strawberries, they like bananas, they like maple leaves, they like all sorts of, anything that you can give them. They like roots of different vegetables. They have preferences. So if you have like a particular fruit that you like, they're right there with you. They have the same dislikes and likes.
Oh.
Me and my sister, we used to have worms, but then we would feed them our compost, but we forgot to, and they died.
Right. Well, you know what happened? You forgot them, and so what they did, because earthworms are actually pretty smart, they left. They were like, "There's no food. We're gonna get out of here." So if there was a way for them to escape, that's what they did. Because if you stop feeding them, some of them will die, but some of them will escape, and then they'll go off and they'll be able to find food on their own.
How did the worms get here from Europe?
Oh, I know you, Sadie. I know you, Carol. So yeah. So yes, I know a lot of people on here today. So how did they get here? Is that what you said? So earthworms, there's a long story of earthworms and how they got here. So if you look back historically, you look back at some of the first explorers that came to North America. So you can look at Christopher Columbus, you can look at a lot of the Spanish explorers, you can even look at the Vikings, because when the Vikings came across, they always kept soil in the bottom of their ships, so the ballast, And so when they would get to the New World or wherever they were going, they would always drop the ballast because they would want their ships to be lighter in the docks. And so those are the introduction points of a lot of these earthworms. And, you know, we may have 21 European earthworms here in Wisconsin, but a lot of them, they didn't all necessarily come that way. They came in when, you know, we had a lot of, you know, the people coming over from the old world to the new world and introducing new things, just like they brought, when you look at the different things that we brought from the old world, worms were part of it. And a really cool thing, like if you look at, I know this is too much for you, Sadie, but when you look at how they grew the tobacco plantations down in the South, they actually brought over a lot of soil from the old world and they introduced it into the tobacco plantations, and that's how we got a lot of our European earthworms. So cool little tidbits like that.
How do we like save the jungle from the jungle worms?
How do we save the jungle from the jungle worms?
Yeah.
Well, the jumping worm. Well, you know, the jumping worms, well, we're going to have to live with the jumping worms because the jumping worms aren't going anywhere. But like I said, I think with the jumping worms, the most important thing is to try and keep them in urban areas right now. And then we want to prevent them from getting to our big forests. So like our big forests that we have in northern Wisconsin, some of our southern forests. And the good thing is that we really haven't found them there, which is a benefit. So we're trying, and you spreading the word about worms after you sat through this so patiently today will help us get the word out that you want to watch your worms.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Bernie. I definitely cannot wait until like 6 o'clock tonight so I can go outside and start digging for worms. Before you all leave, if you can all share in the chat box, first of all, a big thank you to Bernie. We really appreciate you joining us today. And also, if you can chat anything else you want to learn about the outdoors, whether you want to learn about trees or you want to learn about a certain animal, if you could share about that animal in the chat box. We're always looking for suggestions to build more curriculum. And hopefully we can bring more local experts to all of our Girl Scouts. So yeah, if you are interested in more Girl Scout activities like this, you can check out our outdoor naturalist badges where girls can learn about bugs, flowers, trees, the sky, water, and all of those cool ecosystems. So thank you so much for joining me. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to us at Girl Scouts, and we really look forward to connecting with you all again.
Thank you for having me, everybody. Happy Arbor Day.